Maya Davis had just wrapped up a long day at the law firm and was driving home, mentally preparing for the mountain of paperwork awaiting her. She was used to the daily grind, the endless hours spent drafting legal briefs, sifting through case law, and attending back-to-back meetings. But today, something felt different. There was a slight unease in the air, an unsettled energy that she couldn't quite shake. Maybe it was the fatigue setting in, or perhaps the subtle weight of being one of the only black women in her field. She had learned early on that it was important to carry herself with confidence, even on days when it felt like the world was looking for a reason to underestimate her. As she turned onto a quieter street, her headlights illuminated the faded road sign indicating an expired registration sticker. Her stomach dropped. She had meant to update it weeks ago, but the rush of work had consumed her every waking moment. She sighed, not realizing that this small oversight would soon escalate into something much more complicated. Before she could think much about it, the sound of a siren filled the air. Maya's heart skipped a beat, and she instinctively pulled over to the side of the road. She wasn't speeding or driving recklessly, but in this moment, none of that mattered. She had learned to be extra cautious when dealing with law enforcement. It wasn't a matter of just following the rules. It was about survival. The officer who approached her car was middle-aged, with an air of authority that made Maya immediately tense. He peered at her through the window, his expression neutral but impersonal. Without even offering a greeting, he asked for her license and registration, his tone matter-of-fact. Maya kept her voice steady. "I'm sorry, officer. I know my registration is expired. I've been meaning to take care of it. It's been a hectic week." The officer glanced at the expired sticker on her windshield, and then at her. There was a slight pause before he nodded, barely acknowledging her explanation. "That's a violation," he said flatly, jotting down something on his notepad. "I'll need to issue you a ticket." Maya felt a knot form in her stomach. She understood the rule. Expired registration was a legitimate reason to be fined. What stung, however, was the officer's dismissive attitude. It wasn't just the ticket. It was the way he barely looked at her, the way her explanation seemed to fall on deaf ears. She had seen this kind of indifference before, where her presence didn't seem to matter, and her words were rarely taken at face value. She nodded, keeping her composure. "Thank you, officer," she said as he handed her the ticket. She took it quietly, her fingers brushing against the cold paper. The officer didn't say another word before he turned and walked back to his patrol car. Maya sat in her car for a moment, staring at the ticket in her hands. It wasn't the fine that bothered her. It was the feeling of being dismissed, of being invisible, even when she had done nothing wrong. After a long pause, she started the car and drove off, the weight of the ticket a small, yet significant, reminder of the world she still had to navigate. The next morning, Maya awoke early, her mind already buzzing with thoughts of her new role. Today was a pivotal moment, a step into a world she had worked tirelessly to enter. She had dreamed of this day for years, ever since she graduated from law school and began her journey toward becoming a federal judicial clerk. She knew it wasn't going to be easy. The path had always been steep and full of obstacles. But Maya had always believed that the challenges only made her stronger. This was her chance to prove herself in the very system she had once doubted. As she dressed for the day, she glanced at herself in the mirror. The woman staring back at her was confident, poised, and determined. She had spent her entire career facing the scrutiny that came with being a black woman in a field dominated by those who didn't look like her. But today that didn't matter. Today, she would enter the courthouse as a legal professional, no different from anyone else, except that her journey had been harder. Maya arrived at the federal courthouse with just enough time to spare. The towering building stood before her, imposing yet welcoming. She took a deep breath before walking through the security gates, feeling a sense of pride with each step. This was it. This was where her future would unfold. Inside, the courthouse was bustling with activity. Lawyers, clerks, and clients moved through the corridors, each absorbed in their own affairs. Maya was directed to her office, an unassuming space in the heart of the courthouse where she would spend the next year working closely with some of the best legal minds in the country. She took a moment to soak in her surroundings, her pulse quickening with excitement and anticipation. The first order of business was a meeting with her supervisor, Judge Daniel Reynolds. She had heard much about him, a seasoned, respected federal judge known for his sharp mind and unyielding commitment to justice. He was a man of principle, but also one who had earned a reputation for being somewhat intimidating. As Maya prepared to meet him, she couldn't help but wonder what he would be like in person. The door to the courtroom opened, and she walked in. At first, she was caught off guard by the stern look on the judge's face as he addressed the room, his voice commanding attention. But when their eyes met, Maya's stomach dropped. It was him, the same man who had issued her traffic ticket just the day before. Judge Reynolds didn't seem to recognize her, and for a moment, Maya wondered if she should say something. She hesitated. The fine had been minor. After all, just a bureaucratic detail in the grand scheme of things. But here, in this space, with this man, the situation felt entirely different. She took her seat in the back, her mind racing. Could he remember her? Was this a coincidence, or had fate given her an unusual opportunity to cross paths with the very judge who had handed down the fine? Maya pushed the thoughts aside, focusing instead on what she had come here to do: work hard, prove her worth, and make her mark. As the judge continued with his proceedings, Maya sat quietly, her resolve growing stronger with every passing minute. She was ready to face whatever came next, whether that meant working under Judge Reynolds, handling challenging legal cases, or simply proving that she belonged in this world. The following days passed in a blur of legal briefings, research, and meetings with other clerks. Maya threw herself into her work with single-minded focus, determined to make the most of her time in the courthouse. She had been given the opportunity of a lifetime, and she wasn't about to waste it. Her reputation as a sharp thinker, quick learner, and dedicated worker began to take shape in the eyes of her colleagues. She stayed late, read everything she could get her hands on, and always looked for ways to be helpful. But despite her commitment to the job, there was one thing Maya couldn't shake: Judge Daniel Reynolds. Every time she crossed paths with him in the hallways or during meetings, she couldn't help but remember their last encounter, the awkward moment when he had issued her that traffic fine. She had managed to keep her composure, but the sting of that brief interaction remained, lingering in the back of her mind. It wasn't just that he had fined her. It was the way he seemed so indifferent to her, as though she were just another driver on the road, someone not worth noticing. Maya had long since grown accustomed to that kind of treatment, but it didn't make it any easier. At first, she thought the feeling would fade as she became more accustomed to her new role. But as the days wore on, she began to notice subtle shifts in the way Judge Reynolds interacted with her. At first, it was just a fleeting glance when he passed by her desk, his eyes quickly moving away as if he hadn't meant to notice her. Then there was the slight hesitation in his voice when he gave her a task, as if he were unsure of how to address her. She didn't let it affect her, at least not outwardly. She had too much to prove, too much to accomplish. But Maya wasn't blind. She could sense the awkwardness in the air. There was something about working so closely with someone who had fined her just days ago that made their professional relationship feel strained. Judge Reynolds, usually so composed and confident, seemed uncomfortable in her presence. Maya couldn't help but wonder if he had realized who she was, the woman he had pulled over the other day. Could he remember her? Or was it simply a strange coincidence that they were now working together? In one of their brief encounters in the hallway, Maya finally decided to break the silence. She was walking past Judge Reynolds when he stopped her. She looked up to meet his eyes, and for the briefest moment, their gazes locked. He gave her a small, almost apologetic smile, but it wasn't enough to erase the tension in the air. "Maya," he said, his voice carefully neutral. Before he could finish, Maya nodded, a slight professional smile curling on her lips. "No need to explain, Judge. I understand." She didn't want to dwell on the past. There was work to be done. But as she walked away, she couldn't help but feel a mix of relief and uncertainty. It was clear that the fine had left its mark on both of them, and she wasn't sure how things would unfold moving forward. Would they be able to put this awkwardness behind them and work as equals, or would the shadows of their past interaction continue to hover over them? The days blurred into a routine. Maya threw herself into her work, determined to prove herself beyond the moment of awkwardness with Judge Reynolds. She sat in her office, poring over case files, attending briefings, and writing legal memos with the precision of someone who had earned her spot, even if she had to constantly remind herself of that. Her dedication was paying off. Colleagues began to seek her opinion on difficult legal issues, and her supervisor, a senior clerk, was increasingly impressed by her insight. Despite her growing confidence in her role, the tension with Judge Reynolds remained. It wasn't overt, but it lingered like an unspoken elephant in the room whenever their paths crossed. Most of the time, he was professional, offering short, polite exchanges in passing. But there was always a hesitation in his tone, a moment where his eyes would flicker uncomfortably before he moved on. It was subtle, but Maya could feel it every time. Then, one afternoon, she found herself face to face with him once again in the courthouse's quiet hallway. Maya had just finished a long meeting and was heading back to her office when she turned the corner to see Judge Reynolds coming in her direction. They both slowed their pace, clearly aware of each other's presence. For a moment, it was as if the whole hallway grew silent. Maya felt a rush of thoughts whirl in her mind. Should she speak first? Acknowledge the awkwardness, or simply let it pass like everything else? Before she could decide, Judge Reynolds spoke, his voice tentative, as though carefully choosing his words. "Maya," he began, pausing slightly. I just wanted to say something." His tone was less formal than usual, and Maya couldn't help but notice a flicker of unease behind his composed exterior. She tilted her head slightly, offering him a polite but neutral smile. "Of course, Judge," she said, keeping her voice steady, though inside, her heart rate picked up slightly. "I realize we didn't really have a chance to properly talk about the other day," he continued, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her feel both seen and scrutinized at once. "About the ticket." Maya nodded, but didn't immediately respond. She had no intention of holding a grudge. It wasn't about the fine anymore. Anyway, it was about the underlying feeling of being overlooked. But she wasn't sure how much she was willing to share in this moment. She had worked so hard to get here, to be taken seriously in a world where people often underestimated her. She wasn't about to let the fine be a barrier. "You don't have to apologize," she said, keeping her voice calm and measured. "It's just a ticket. I've got much more on my plate now." Judge Reynolds gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, as if he were relieved that she hadn't pressed him. But there was something in his eyes, a flicker of regret, that made Maya pause. She realized that despite his outward confidence, he was struggling with the irony of the situation. "I appreciate that, Maya," he said quietly. "I want you to know I respect you as a professional, and Maya interrupted, her gaze firm but kind. "Judge, it's fine. Really, let's just move forward." She didn't want to dwell on it any longer. There was work to do, and it was far more important to focus on her role in the courthouse than to get caught up in the uncomfortable residue of the past. She gave him a brief, purposeful nod and stepped around him to continue down the hall, determined to leave the past behind. But as she walked away, Maya couldn't help but feel a subtle shift in the air, a change in the dynamic between her and the judge. Perhaps, just perhaps, this moment marked the beginning of something different, something better. Maya's first few weeks as a judicial clerk flew by, filled with the kind of work that made her feel alive. The cases were complex, challenging, and required every ounce of her legal acumen. She spent countless hours in the courthouse's law library, poring over case precedents, reading statutes, and drafting legal opinions. It was demanding, but it also felt like exactly where she belonged. Her relationship with Judge Reynolds remained polite but distant. Their brief interactions were usually functional, him giving her a task, her reporting back with results. But the unease between them had started to dissipate. The ticket, once a weight in the back of Maya's mind, seemed to fade in importance as they both settled into their roles. Yet every so often, she would catch him looking at her a little longer than necessary, his eyes lingering with a mixture of curiosity and respect. Then, one afternoon, Maya was summoned to Judge Reynolds' chambers for a brief meeting. It was a small, informal gathering, just the two of them to discuss an upcoming case. Maya had been assigned to assist him with a particularly tricky case involving corporate misconduct. The stakes were high, and the legal questions surrounding it were complex, but Maya felt confident in her ability to contribute. She entered his office, a space lined with law books and dark wood furniture. Judge Reynolds sat behind his large mahogany desk, a stack of case files neatly arranged before him. He gestured for her to take a seat across from him, his expression serious but not unfriendly. "Maya, I wanted to ask for your insight on something," he said, his tone professional but tinged with the hint of genuine interest. "You've been working hard on this case, and I've been impressed by your analysis so far. You seem to have a fresh perspective on the corporate liability issue. I'd like to hear your thoughts on how we should approach it in court." Maya's heart raced at the unexpected praise. It wasn't that she wasn't used to being competent, but the recognition from a seasoned judge like Reynolds was something else entirely. She had spent so long feeling like she had to work twice as hard to be seen, especially as one of the few black women in her field, that she hadn't anticipated this moment would come so soon. "Thank you, Judge," she said, her voice steady, but filled with gratitude. "In my analysis, I believe the key issue is distinguishing between direct and indirect corporate liability. The plaintiffs have a strong case, but there are several nuances that we'll need to address to make sure the defense doesn't get away with undermining the company's responsibility. We might also need to look into the precedents regarding corporate governance and executive accountability." Judge Reynolds listened intently, nodding as she spoke. She could tell he was genuinely processing her input, not just paying lip service. For a moment, it felt as though their roles had shifted, not in a formal sense, but in a way that felt more equal, as though he saw her for the skilled professional she was, not just the clerk sitting at his desk. "You make a strong point," he said after a moment. "I hadn't considered that angle. We'll need to incorporate your suggestions into the brief for the upcoming hearing." Maya felt a surge of pride. It was a small victory, but it was a significant one. In that moment, Judge Reynolds had not only acknowledged her competence, but had relied on her expertise in a way that felt authentic and untainted by their earlier awkwardness. It was the kind of respect that Maya had longed for, the kind that made all the hard work worth it. As she left his chambers, Maya couldn't help but feel a renewed sense of purpose. The journey ahead was still long, but she was no longer just the clerk in the background. She was part of the team, a valuable contributor to the process. And that, she realized, was worth more than any apology or acknowledgement of past wrongs. Maya left Judge Reynolds' chambers with a quiet sense of accomplishment. The praise he had offered for her insight on the corporate liability case had been unexpected, but deeply appreciated. It wasn't just about the work. It was about being seen, truly seen, as an equal among her colleagues. The acknowledgement felt like a small but meaningful shift in their dynamic, a signal that her hard work had not gone unnoticed. However, despite the positive exchange, Maya knew that their professional relationship was still a delicate balance. She had worked so hard to get here, to prove that she belonged in a space where people like her often had to fight for recognition. But there was something about Judge Reynolds that still made her feel uneasy, even now, after weeks of positive interaction. As the days went on, Maya noticed that she began to see Judge Reynolds in a new light. His demeanor was less cold and more approachable, though he still maintained the same air of authority. She found herself respecting him in ways she hadn't anticipated, not just for his legal knowledge, but for the vulnerability he had shown in admitting his past missteps. There was a quiet humility in him that was hard to ignore. Still, every so often, Maya caught herself thinking back to that moment. the one where he had fined her for the expired registration. It wasn't about the money. It was about the judgment she had felt in that brief encounter. She had been dismissed, not given the chance to explain herself. And even though it had been a small, fleeting interaction, the sting of it lingered in the back of her mind. It was hard to shake the feeling that she was always a step behind, always fighting for recognition in spaces that weren't meant for people like her. One evening, as Maya was leaving the courthouse after another long day of work, she bumped into Judge Reynolds again. This time, it was in the parking garage. He had just finished a meeting with a colleague, and the two of them were walking in the same direction toward their cars. "Good evening, Maya," he said, his voice calm but friendly. "I hope your day went well." Maya smiled, acknowledging him with a nod. "It did, thank you, Judge." They walked together in silence for a few moments, both lost in their own thoughts. But then, to her surprise, Judge Reynolds spoke again. "I've been thinking about that ticket," he said, his voice softer now. "I didn't handle it the way I should have. I've been meaning to apologize." Maya's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't expected him to bring it up again, especially not outside the courthouse. But his words, sincere and thoughtful, caught her off guard. For a moment, she wasn't sure how to respond. She had moved past it, hadn't she? But then, without thinking too much about it, she said, "It's okay, Judge. I understand. We all make mistakes." He stopped walking for a moment, looking at her. "It's not just about the ticket, Maya. It's about how I handled it. How I treated you. I shouldn't have dismissed you like that." Maya could hear the sincerity in his voice, and for the first time, she realized that maybe he had been carrying the weight of that moment too. Maybe it hadn't been just her who felt the awkwardness. "It's in the past," Maya said, her voice steady but gentle. "I don't hold it against you." For a brief moment, their eyes locked, and she saw a flicker of understanding pass between them. It was as though the years of unspoken tension between them, the unacknowledged discomfort, had suddenly dissipated. As they reached their cars, Judge Reynolds gave her a small nod. "Thank you, Maya. I'll see you tomorrow." "Good night, Judge," she replied, her tone warm and genuine. As Maya got into her car and drove away, she felt a quiet sense of peace settle within her. She had been right to push forward, to keep doing the work. She had been right to focus on proving her worth, not just to others, but to herself. And in this moment, she felt like she was finally getting the recognition she deserved, not just for her legal skills, but for her humanity. It wasn't about the ticket anymore. It wasn't about past mistakes. It was about the future and how, together, she and Judge Reynolds could move forward with a newfound respect. As the weeks turned into months, Maya's confidence continued to grow. She had proven herself in the courtroom, earning the trust of her colleagues, and gaining the respect of Judge Reynolds. The dynamic between them shifted from one of awkwardness to one of mutual respect, though there remained an unspoken understanding of their past encounter. Maya no longer felt like she was constantly trying to prove herself. Her work spoke for itself, and Judge Reynolds seemed to have fully recognized her value. But despite their professional progress, Maya couldn't ignore the way things had shifted between them, even in small, subtle ways. Judge Reynolds, for all his experience and stature, had become more approachable, more willing to engage with her on a level that felt less formal and more personal. The occasional interactions they had in the hallways and in their chambers no longer carried the weight of the past. Instead, they had become a source of camaraderie, as they collaborated on case strategies and legal analyses. One afternoon, after a particularly long day of reviewing briefs for an upcoming case, Maya found herself sitting at her desk in the law library, surrounded by stacks of documents. She was exhausted, her mind clouded with legal jargon and case law, but she was determined to push through. Her phone buzzed, a message from Judge Reynolds appearing on the screen. "Maya, I'd like to discuss the case in my chambers. Can you meet me in 15 minutes? It wasn't unusual for Judge Reynolds to ask her to meet him, but there was something about this message that caught Maya's attention. There was a sense of urgency in his words, a tone that implied they were about to tackle something important. She quickly gathered her papers and made her way to his chambers, her curiosity piqued. When she entered, Judge Reynolds was standing by his desk, his usual calm demeanor replaced by a hint of tension in his posture. He gestured for her to sit and immediately dove into the matter at hand. "Maya, I've been reviewing the case, and there's an angle I think we've missed," he began, pacing slightly. "We've been focusing too much on the legal precedents, but we're overlooking the human element. There's something in the defendant's history that could turn the case in our favor, but we need to dig deeper." Maya's mind began to race as she absorbed his words. The human element. She knew exactly what he was referring to. The defendant in question had a complicated background, and it had been easy to focus solely on the technicalities of the law. But Judge Reynolds' point made sense. In cases like these, understanding the human side of things could often make all the difference. She quickly responded with her thoughts. "If we bring that up in court, we need to have solid evidence to back it up. It's a sensitive issue, and it could easily backfire if not handled properly." Judge Reynolds nodded, his eyes intense. "Exactly. That's why I'm relying on you to help me dig into this. We need to be thorough, but we also need to approach it with caution. Your insights into this could be the key to winning the case." Maya felt a surge of pride. This wasn't just a task, it was a partnership. For the first time, she felt like they were truly working together as equals, each bringing their own expertise to the table. There was no longer any sense of hierarchy or tension. It was a collaboration grounded in respect and trust. "I'll get started right away," she said, her voice steady and determined. As she left his chambers, Maya felt a renewed sense of purpose. The road ahead would undoubtedly be challenging, but she was no longer facing it alone. She and Judge Reynolds had forged a path forward, one where their professional relationship had evolved beyond the confines of a single awkward moment. Together, they were more than just colleagues. They were a team. And as Maya looked toward the future, she realized that the work she had done to get to this point was only the beginning. There was so much more to achieve, so many more challenges to face. But now, for the first time, she truly felt like she was where she belonged. The days following Maya's deep dive into the case were some of the most intense and rewarding she'd experienced. With Judge Reynolds' trust and guidance, she uncovered crucial details about the defendant's past that had previously gone unnoticed. The human element in the case proved to be a turning point. Maya's thorough research and insights made all the difference in how they were able to approach the case in court. The jury responded positively, and the verdict ultimately swayed in their favor. During the trial, Judge Reynolds, who had once seemed distant, now seemed entirely different. He often sought her input in front of the courtroom, visibly valuing her opinion in a way that made Maya feel like an integral part of the team. It wasn't just the legal wins, it was the acknowledgement of her as an equal, a trusted advisor. She was no longer just the clerk. She was a key player. One afternoon, as the trial came to a close and they began to review their next steps, Judge Reynolds asked Maya to join him for a private discussion in his chambers. As she walked through the door, she found him seated at his desk, looking thoughtful but not at all distant. The transformation was evident in the way he regarded her now. This wasn't just professional distance, it was a partnership forged through hard work and mutual respect. "Maya," he began, his tone calm but sincere, "I can't thank you enough for your hard work on this case. You played a crucial role in our success. I've learned a lot from you these past few months, and I want you to know I see you for the incredible professional that you are." Maya felt a mix of pride and humility. She had always known she was capable, but hearing it from him, someone who had once seemed so indifferent, meant something more. It wasn't just about the acknowledgement. It was about the understanding that their relationship had come full circle. The awkwardness had melted away, replaced by genuine respect. "Thank you, Judge," she replied, her voice steady but warm. "It's been an honor to work with you. We make a good team." Judge Reynolds smiled, his eyes softening. "I couldn't agree more. And I hope this is just the beginning. "You've proven yourself, Maya. I have no doubt you'll go far in this field." The words resonated deeply with her. They were more than just words of encouragement. They were the recognition she had longed for when she first started this journey. She wasn't simply the clerk anymore. She was someone who had earned a seat at the table. As she left his chambers, Maya walked with her head held high. The courthouse had become more than just a place of work. It was a space where she had proved her worth, where she had fought not just for professional respect, but for personal growth. She had weathered the discomfort of their initial interaction, pushed through moments of self-doubt, and emerged on the other side, stronger than ever. The journey wasn't over. There were still challenges ahead, and her path wasn't always going to be easy. But as Maya walked through the courthouse halls, she knew one thing for sure. She had earned her place, and she was ready for whatever came next. For the first time in a long time, Maya felt like she truly belonged.